Okay, if we can turn to another issue that was occupying Canberra today, the UN Human Rights Commissioner met with Julia Gillard and the Immigration Minister Chris Bowen. What was on the agenda there?
Two issues really, the government's continued support for the controversial intervention into Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory and Australia's border protection and mandatory detention system. Before the meeting, the Commissioner Navi Pillay had said that the move to fly asylum seekers to Malaysia would breach international law. After his meeting with her, Chris Bowen said that Ms Pillay had warmed to the plan. I spoke to her this afternoon and asked if that's the way that she saw it.
The screening process will be done by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, his office, which means under UN supervision. So I do feel that's a reassuring factor. And the other is that they are going to draw an agreement between the government of Malaysia and the government of Australia, which will tie in protection safeguards.
But you don't think that's enough, do you?
Well, that's my job. You see, I don't just cover the Refugee Convention that the High Commissioner for Refugee does. My mandate is to look at human rights concerns which appear in all the treaties and conventions adopted by the United Nations.
Do you think that Australia will still be in contravention of international law, which is what you said before these meetings?
I said there is a risk if the safeguards are not put in those agreements, even if they put in the agreements, if they're not observed, then Australia will be in breach of all the international undertakings that they have ratified.
You seem to suggest today that even a written assurance wasn't enough from Malaysia.
I'm looking at all the jurisprudence. I'm, after all, a judge for very many years. I'm very familiar with the jurisprudence that is emerged from the courts. So just an assurance is not enough, and more so in the particular case of Malaysia, because they have not facilitated the work of the High Commissioner for Refugees in Malaysia. They have not ratified the Refugee Convention or the Torture Convention, Rights of the Child. And they have more than 90,000 asylum seekers in their own country, and I don't know under what conditions they are being kept.
Can people not get a little bit confused by this? Because, of course, Malaysia was elected to the UN Human Rights Council. So did you raise any concerns about Malaysia when it got elected to that position?
The Human Rights Council reviews the human rights situation of every country. They have reviewed 175 so far. Australia was reviewed in January this year, and Malaysia was reviewed in 2009. The review is done by other member states. So many states, including Australia, recommended to Malaysia that they protect the asylum seekers.
I guess it might be a question in people's minds, though. The United Nations does stand then in judgment of other countries, but on that council in particular, there's been a long history of having countries like Libya attached to it, who have appalling human rights records. And then how can the United Nations then stand in judgment of other countries' human rights records?
All right, firstly, it's not the United Nations standing in judgments, it's other member states. That's why it's a peer review. It's members telling each other, this is what you need to do in your country. And you are quite right. With Libya and Egypt, member states were too kind. There's always a debate about these. And they gave them a fairly clean slate. And now you see the people have been forced to come out onto the street to say their human rights have not been addressed.
With Australia's record, and you're talking about how for a long time now there's been concern about mandatory detention. What specifically are your concerns about that?
Mandatory detention is a violation of international law. And why it's a violation is that, firstly, it's very arbitrary. You're supposed to look at each individual case to see whether it's a genuine asylum seeker. But when you lock them all up, it is arbitrary. Sometimes it's indefinite.
But you also suggested today that you believe there's an element of racism in it.
Well, as I look around, I see that the Australia has to do a great deal to address discrimination of all kinds, including racial discrimination. And when you look at the nationalities of the asylum seekers and migrants who come here, they're obviously not from the West or European states. So there is an element of racism. This is what the victims told me as I spoke with very many of them. while on this mission, and that is that there is racial discrimination against them. They are treated differently. And long after they get their visas, they still have difficulty in finding employment, finding housing.
You're not concerned, though, by the argument that some of the people who are in detention who have come by boats have paid people smugglers. So, in fact, they flew into Kuala Lumpur, they paid $15,000 to a people smuggler, and having a system which was more open, in fact, led to more boats arriving in Australia. Isn't the humane thing to do to make sure that no boats leave in the first place?
I, of course, support Australia and every country's efforts to stop people smuggling. It's a crime. It's usually run by huge syndicates, and they, in turn, victimize the people who pay them these huge sums of money. But that doesn't mean that you then treat all people who come here to Australia to seek asylum as people who've been smuggled here. There's just two situations here. And it does not help to now pick up all the people who came on these boats and detain them. I understand there are 19 children now who landed recently at Christmas Island. And why are they detaining children, for instance? How is that going to help getting the smugglers?
You also went to the Northern Territory looking at the intervention, which is 4 years old, in fact, very shortly. What's your view on what's been happening there?
Clearly, the Aborigine and Indigenous peoples in that whole territory feel that they have not benefited by the intervention, and they really troubled by the fact that they need housing. They now live